Good evening, and thank you so much for joining us here on PBS Fort Wayne. The show is called Life Ahead. I'm the host, Sandy Thomson, but the real stars of the show you'll meet in just a moment. We're going to be talking tonight about retirement and what happens if you have some problems with that retirement, if you're asked to sign a release. Are there discriminations you need to know about? So a lot of things within that topic. And I invite you to give us a call with questions that you might have. Our guests tonight are attorneys, so they will be able to give you the legal explanations for those questions. The number, 969-2720. Give us a call anytime here in the next half hour. We don't have any commercials. We're going straight through. Let's get started, first of all, by having you meet our guest. You've both been here before, so maybe you recognize that we have Troy Kiefer with us here on the far side. Okay, Troy, and Ted Storer. Ted, thank you so much for coming back.
Thank you, Sandy, for having us.
We did a similar topic about a year or so ago. We had some very interesting phone calls, and I encourage you, if you have phone calls, to get on the phone and get into us here. We'd love it when you are willing to talk to us live on the air, because that way, if Ted or Troy have questions back to you, you're right there on the phone. But if you don't feel comfortable doing that, that's okay. We have somebody answering the phone in the control room that will take your question, type it up, and send it out to me here on the teleprompter, and I'll ask them for you. Well, until we get some phone calls, let me ask you guys a few questions. Okay, let's start with the age 40. That seems to be a magic number. Why is that? What's the concern about being 40 and asked to leave?
Sure. Well, the age of 40, if you look at statistics, the United States Bureau of Labor Statistics came out, and the median age of all of our employees in the United States is 42.7 years as of the census in 2023. So that corresponds with a law called the Age Discrimination in Employment Act, the ADEA.
Okay.
And the ADEA tells us and makes it a law that employers cannot discriminate or harass employees if they are over the age of 40 by giving better or preferential treatment to younger employees. So employees over the age of 40 are actually protected from certain types of adverse employment actions.
Like?
Well, discrimination, harassment, things like you can't be terminated because you are old.
Over 40. Okay.
Okay. Or over 40. And the protection isn't necessarily, are you over the age of 40 and been terminated? The question is, have you been terminated because of your age?
Yeah.
And have you been replaced by someone younger? So this is designed to help protect those employees who are more than 40 years old. Again, that is a magic age under the statute. And to help them stay in the job force and help employers retain those employees. So,
well, the thing is, by the time you reach 40, you're probably a better employee because you have some experience, but employers don't always see that. Have you had to deal with discrimination cases at all?
No, not frankly, not too much.
What would be typical discriminations that people might bring before an attorney? Is it?
And I'm happy to answer that, Troy, if you'd like.
Please go right ahead.
So the types of discrimination that people view or people have, I mean, termination, of course, is the most severe type of adverse action that someone can suffer. However, there's also lack of promotion. If you're finding that you have the experience and you are in the same job classification, sometimes there are questions about whether or not they're promoting a younger employer. Maybe the younger employer isn't at the same salary level, and so the employer may be thinking they're protecting the pocketbook, so to speak.
Sure.
But that older employee probably has more experience, more knowledge, and probably should be protected. Sometimes there are little things that employers may do. Hey, we need to get younger in the workforce. Those types of things are sometimes some keywords that employees should be on the lookout just to make sure that they're being treated. Now, in Northeast Indiana, I will tell you, it's very seldom that we have any sort of direct or adverse action where you know it's because of your age. And employers may not even think about this when they make some employment decisions. But those are the types of typical adverse job actions. You know, people talk about hostile work environment a lot when it comes to employment. A hostile work environment doesn't just mean that it's no fun to work. It has to be designed and it has to be based on a protected classification. So the types of discrimination are out there. You can look online and find all those, but it really takes an adverse job action, and sometimes that can just be as limited as, hey, I applied for a promotion and didn't get it. Yep. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that the employer didn't have a legitimate business reason why they made that decision, because an employer is always entitled to make a business decision.
Sure.
It just can't be based on a protected classification. And for our audience, where we're talking about life ahead and older workers, that may be an age issue.
Do they have to tell the employee why they didn't choose them for the promotion or for a particular job? Do they owe them that courtesy or not?
Well, the question is, are they legally required versus do they owe that as a courtesy?
Sure.
I would suggest that any employer probably would want to explain to their workforce why they've made a decision. Yeah. And that would be beneficial because there's probably a reason why they made that decision that's not based upon some protected classification.
Got it.
And the employee should want to know that. I find in my practice that it's an absence of communication between an employer and an employee that really causes a breakdown in the discussion or a breakdown in the circumstance where one person says, well, that's it, I'm leaving, or the employer has to make a decision that you need to go. So communication is very important when it comes to employment decisions.
It's a tricky thing when you're working with something that's an emotional issue. Troy, I have a question for you. I know that you know a lot about Medicaid and estate planning. How does, age or working as an older employee, what does that have to do with estate planning and Medicaid? Anything?
Yeah, that will affect that in a couple of different areas. It will affect the overall estate planning because presumably you'll end up with more money when it's time to retire, so you have more to plan for. Also, in terms of Social Security and Medicaid, they have caps on income in order to continue to receive those benefits. So that's something to keep an eye on. If a person's receiving Social Security and they're under retirement age, I think the maximum they can make is about $22,000 before their Social Security will start to be pulled back.
I see.
And once they reach retirement age, right now it's 2024, 67 years old, there is no limit on income you can make if you're over that age, but it's that transition period when a person's receiving Social Security but hasn't reached that full retirement age yet.
Got it. Well, speaking of full retirement age, and we've been talking about 40 being the magic number, where maybe you are considered. Would you be considered an older employee by the law?
By the law, yes.
Okay.
40 is the floor. If you are 39 years old, you're not protected by the ADEA.
Okay. Now, how does one find out about that? I mean, let's say that some of you watching are working and have moved past that magic number of 40. How do you know who to get a hold of or how to find somebody to help you make this transition or help you understand the law?
Sure, and there's a couple aspects to that. If an employee believes that they've suffered an adverse job action, they haven't been given the promotion that they think they were entitled to, or they've been terminated from their employment, there are two things that an employee can do. The first thing is always look at your employment handbook, always look at the policies of your employer and know who you need to complain to internally. Most of the time there's a human resource director, and if you have a concern that you've been discriminated or harassed based upon a protected class, you'll want to make sure that that human resource department is aware of it. If you don't report that to the human resource department, you could always seek the advice of an attorney and ask the attorney whether or not you think you have an actionable claim. And then the last thing you do, and it's often a requirement, is there are agencies, both state and federal, who protect employees who have been harassed and discriminated. And I say protect, I mean those agencies will investigate claims. So in Fort Wayne, we're lucky enough to have what's been called the Fort Wayne Metropolitan Human Relations Commission.
Say that again, that's a big name.
How about I just say Metro?
Metro.
Metro is
Metro.
here, and Metro is a local agency that investigates charges of discrimination or harassment. Now, they do not advocate on behalf of any employee, but they will take your concern and they may investigate your claim if you believe that you've been discriminated against.
Would people go to them directly, or can they skip their employer?
They may. I would suggest, though, for anyone, and this is true for employers and employees both, an employer should have a good policy. And that policy should say, if employees believe that they've been mistreated for whatever reason, please come and tell HR. Because an employer, they can't guess or read the mind of an employee.
Okay.
So unless that employee tells the employer can't take a reasonable step to protect that employee or to investigate.
But you know, I've heard people say that they're hesitant to go to HR, Human Resources, if they have an issue or fear that they're discriminated against, because they're thinking that the HR person is going to be with the employer. They're going to be with the administration in terms of their view of things, and will take their side. What do you think?
Well, I can't tell you that a HR representative is not going to look and investigate from the standpoint of, did we make a proper decision on behalf of the employer? But again, there may be a policy, and if the employer is not aware that the employee feels that they've been discriminated against, the employer's only job under the ADEA or other employment protection statutes is to conduct a reasonable investigation and take appropriate action.
Got it. Okay.
And if you, as the employee, don't tell the employer, then the employer may not know and may not be able to take that step. And then when you do go and complain to Metro or the EEOC down in Indianapolis, they will look at it and say, did you follow the internal policies? And if you didn't, Metro and the EEOC may say, well, even if there was discrimination, you don't have a claim because you didn't follow the reasonable as they determine
By starting where you worked first.
Correct.
Troy, we were talking a little while ago about signing releases, that often if you're terminated, you're asked to sign a release. What's that all about? What will a release consist of, and do you have to sign it?
Yeah, well, when a person is asked to no
Leave.
longer have their
No
employment
longer work there.
Yes, they're often presented with a release or an agreement. It's basically a contract that says that the employee that's leaving will maybe do a number of things, maybe won't share information, maybe won't publicly disparage the organization, their employer, and there may be some other things, but in exchange for that, they'll receive a severance package. And so, like all contracts, it's a give and take, and
Sure.
I think it's sometimes employers might present it in such a way as it's here, sign this on your way out the door, and not really explain it to the employee. So it's good to, anytime you sign something, especially in an adversarial situation like that, that you know what you're signing, and if you have any questions, talk to an attorney.
Would you ask the boss then, or whomever is presenting you with that release and asking you to sign it, would you ask them for a certain time period so that you have an opportunity to read it closely and get legal advice?
Yeah, I think that's very reasonable. They may, you know.
Is that customary?
You know, Ted may have a good answer for that. I'm not.
What do you think, Chad?
More and more we're seeing, even for employees under the age of 40, that the employer will not just terminate an employee on a Friday and say, sign this on your way out the door, because it doesn't give the employee time to consider it. For workers over the age of 40, there's a special law that requires the employer to give the employee 21 days to consider a severance package.
Oh, okay.
And
so you don't have to sign it right away.
So you don't have to sign it right away, because if you aren't given that 21 days, the release, the promise not to sue your employer, is not enforceable. They have to give you 21 days. Again, but that's only for workers over the age of 40. However, many employers simply incorporate that for all severance. Now, when we talk about severance and releases like that, we advise, Troy and my firm and myself, we advise both employees and employers. And we always advise the employer to get a release if you're going to pay a severance to an employee. So just because the employer may offer a severance, that doesn't necessarily mean that the employer believes they've done something wrong. An employee may have been a dedicated employee for a long time and they want to reward that performance.
Oh, okay.
But even if that's true, and this is supposed to be a reward, we always advise our clients, make sure you get something back from the employee, and that is usually a release.
Got it. Well, all right, so what happens, let's say that you've been asked to leave your job for whatever reason, and your bosses ask you to sign a release saying things like you mentioned, Troy, that you won't say anything bad about that company or whatever is in that release form. What if you do break that? Can they sue you? How does that work?
Well, that's going to depend on the terms of the release.
Okay.
Some more sophisticated employers and some more sophisticated employees who have been around, who are maybe at a C level, a president or a high level vice president, they're going to understand that there are going to be some terms and conditions.
Okay.
Generally, a release agreement or a severance package is deemed to be confidential, and so they're going to want to have you keep that information confidential. There may be a reason why you, as a departing employee, are getting more than someone else, and the employer wouldn't want to create the expectation on behalf of any employee that they're going to get severance, particularly if there's a difference between terminating somebody because business is down versus terminating someone because they've done something wrong to hurt the business.
Got it.
So the employer may want to keep that confidential, and generally they do. And so if there's a confidentiality provision, the employer is probably going to ask for some protection to make sure that that agreement is kept confidential. And so that could be a return of the severance. That could be if you're getting paid over a period of time that the employer says the release is still binding, but because you violated the confidentiality provision, we don't have to continue to pay you anymore.
Maybe you had some company secrets or whatever, and you've shared those with somebody else or with the next employer that you have, so that might be against that. Troy, in talking about estate planning and Medicaid, can you take, let's say you have a 401k with a business and you're leaving that business, do you take that with you or do you start cashing in everything? How does all that work with retirement issues?
Yeah, you can very much take that with you, and you can transfer that over to a new employer, or in case of an IRA, you can take that to a financial advisor and have them manage it. So you're not locked into that employer, and it's a good idea to know what you have, and since you don't have a relationship with them anymore, to move that along to someone else. It is kind of amazing how many times people will forget that they have it, and they leave, and it just sort of gets lost in the shuffle, and then we're finding it on Indiana Unclaimed or something like that.
That's where some of those things come from.
Yeah.
All right, now tell me, everybody looks at that, right? Everybody thinks, oh, maybe, I have
today's the day.
Maybe I have a great aunt that willed me a lake house or something, and I just don't know about it yet. What are some of the biggest issues that you find, Ted, if you're working with somebody that thinks they've been discriminated against? Let's say that the employer tells you, you've been doing a fine job, but we're moving into new technology or a new way of doing things, and so we think we need to hire somebody. They won't say the words younger, but they might say that's more up to date. How do you deal with that?
Well, a lot of that is going to be fact sensitive based upon the circumstance that every employee finds themselves in.
Sure.
And so you have to look at it. And again, this goes back to the earlier statement that you and I were having, where communication is very important.
Right.
Older workers now know how to use computers. They know how to use technology, especially if their job is technologically based. They know how to use those vital programs.
Right.
So employees can be trained, employees can be re-educated, whatever term we want to use. Employees more and more are susceptible and capable of taking on new challenges. We see people who are now in a second career, people who've been in the military and now they're coming back. Those people are highly adaptable, and I think that statistics are showing that more and more the older workforce is capable of taking on more and more information and doing new things.
Than maybe they thought 10 or 20 years ago.
Right.
Yeah. All right, let's talk about, let's say that you have been released from some job, but you're an older worker, we'll say, again, using your number, 40 or over, or even 60. How do you go about finding a new job? What would you look for, Troy, and what should a resume include that might convince people you're still valuable?
Yeah. Well, and I think a resume should accentuate the experience. And,
Sure.
and that's something that cannot be bought, cannot be taught. And if you've been there, you've done that, I would think that would be very attractive to an employer. I think you would want to play down the age situation.
Are you legally required to tell them your age?
Absolutely not.
Ha-ha, that's a good...
And they're not even supposed to ask.
A good consideration. All right, the person interviewing you for the new job can't ask you your age, right?
Correct.
Legally?
Correct.
Okay, and you aren't required legally to tell them up front,
Correct.
right?
During the interview process, it generally doesn't come up, but everybody knows who's filled out a job application that at some point there's a little statement that says date of birth.
Yeah.
Now, usually that's going to be very important at the hiring time, once you've hired, because there are benefits and we have things like health insurance. And health
Sure.
insurance providers need to know that because statistically the health insurance company can use that information. But the
Need to.
employer, they need to. But the employer should not be basing their decisions based upon, well, my health insurance premiums are going up. There's a special law talking about that. So you can get that information once the job offer has been made and once the application process goes into the hiring process, because a number of tax forms, a number of forms
Will
talk
require
about that
birth.
date of birth. So once that's there, it remains confidential, but it can be used for those particular forms.
But as they're, let's say the person that's interviewing you, the human resources or whomever at the new place of employment, they might be able to try to figure out an age based on your resume, like the years you went to college or how many years you worked here or there. They might be able to get a ballpark, but they can't discriminate again, right?
Well, they're not supposed to discriminate or make a decision based upon that factor of age.
Okay.
So one thing you can do if you're looking for jobs, the other thing is relevant job experience is important. As Troy was saying, you want to make sure that your resume is full and robust, but at the same time, knowing that I once sold suits at LS Ayres probably isn't going to get me a job at my next law firm. Not that I'm looking.
Well, I don't know. I think that's pretty admirable.
But we have that. But I mean, you want to make sure when you're looking at your resume to keep that resume with the relevant job experience, not necessarily something you've done 30 years ago that may not be relevant.
So how many years back would you say a person should go in doing their resume?
Well, usually when you're talking about that, you're looking at how many jobs, maybe not a time period for a year, but you want to make sure that you're putting in relevant experience for the last 2 or 3 jobs so your prospective employer can see that.
When are you, this is a difficult question. Oh, wait a minute, we have a call coming in here from a viewer. Let's take that first. Leonard called in and he says, what about if an employee says you are overqualified? Is that a form of discrimination? That's a good question. What do you think?
Well, I would suggest that it's going to depend upon the job, because most employers have an idea of the type of person they are looking for that position. But if somebody has an MBA, let's say, the employer may not want to hire a person with an MBA who may have higher salary demands for a simple bookkeeping position where you may only need a college degree or maybe even an associate's degree.
Yeah.
So the simple identification that someone is overqualified isn't one of those terms that we normally think about. It could be based upon the factual situation, but normally the employer is going to be looking for an employee with certain qualifications. And if someone's overqualified, they're overqualified.
Okay, anything to add to that, Troy? At what point does somebody become overqualified, or too qualified for a job. I don't know how to explain that, but
Yeah, I think Ted answered it perfectly, and he gave a great example.
Okay.
And there are a number of reasons why I would think an employer would be a little hesitant to hire someone who typically wouldn't have that type of job because they have a higher education or more experience.
They might think they'll not be happy in this job anyway, and they'll probably want to leave within a year. Okay, give me some closing thoughts. We have 1 minute.
Well, when you're over the age of 40, you have a number of things to consider that someone first joining the workforce just doesn't.
Yes.
You have issues, as Troy's talked about your 401. You have other benefits. You have health insurance. You have issues in regard to, are you going to be covered by a COBRA continuation, or is it time for you and your family to start considering Medicaid?
Yeah.
If I am an employee and I'm going on Medicaid and I have always covered my dependents, there may be issues about whether they're qualified, my spouse, for Medicaid, or whether she needs to stay on my health insurance. So there's a number of issues that older workers have to consider that younger workers don't.
Don't have to.
And that's just because of the stage of our life. And so we want to make sure that those retirement benefits are there, those health insurance, we have the coverage we need to get the care and to maintain the style of life that we're used to.
I think younger employees don't think about those things. And when they have a company meeting and talk about 401ks and this and that, and they're like, what's that? You know, I don't care about that, you know, just as long as I get out on Fridays at 5 o'clock. You know, you never know. Thank you both for sharing such valuable information with our viewers. I really appreciate that.
Well, thank you for having us.
Yeah, thank
And
you.
I think you all do too. And in fact, next Wednesday night, we'll have another topic right here at 7:30 on Life Ahead. Meanwhile, you stay healthy and stay happy and enjoy your job if you have one.
The preceding program on PBS Fort Wayne was made possible in part by
Beers Mallers, elder law attorneys providing information on legal matters of guardianship and financial issues relating to nursing home care. Beers Mallers attorneys can also assist with Medicaid requirements and help navigate difficult family situations. Offices in Fort Wayne, LaGrange, Warsaw, and online at beersmallers.com.